I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with us Dr. Roger McFillin. He's a clinical psychiatrist, and as you can see from behind his head, he's head of the Cali. No, I'm just kidding. It's the Radically Genuine podcast, and it's really a great trip down, not down memory lane, but down creating memories lane. He has wonderful topics, and he's not afraid. It is kind of a radical, refreshing point of view that he brings, and he a good debater, I would say. I was listening just now to the conversation he had with Dr. Ragi Gergis, who's a Columbia psychiatrist. Maybe we'll get to that about what's kind of taken tacitly and not necessarily always definable or scientifically proven in psychiatry. So I think Dr. McFillin, if I may go out on a limb here, is a little bit of a skeptic as far as psychiatric potential overreach and the over medicalization of our populace. Correct me if I'm wrong here, and fill in the blanks, please.
Yeah, first I just want to correct you. I'm a clinical psychologist, not a psychiatrist. So that's a very important distinction. No problem. Yeah, I would say I'm part of a critical psych movement for many good reasons, right? So here we are, the year's 2025. There's not many medical treatments or interventions that we can say increase the likelihood of a condition and worsen the outcomes by at least 1,000-fold, which is what has happened when we have turned and medicalized our mental health over to psychiatry and primary care, in which we reduce that to certain brain chemicals and target them with pharmaceuticals. The last I looked, I think there's about close to 25% of the US population is on some psychiatric drug. And we're as miserable as we've ever been in recorded history. All the major statistics are indisputable. There's a rise in suicide, rise in professional help. There's a rise in identifying with these labels, such as clinical depression. Clinical depression, historically, in its severest form, has been very rare. Less than 1% of the population at any one time would identify them as themselves as being in a severe depressive episode. You bring SSRIs, quote unquote, antidepressants to the market, and now there's somewhere between 25 to 30% of Americans will identify themselves to be clinically depressed at any one time. So I'm trying to be reasonable, but the more we seek out mental health care in the mental health industrial complex, the worse we see we are, including therapies.
So you may not believe this, but I have some friends. And I was talking with one of my friends the other day, and he's a really great guy, talented, runs a business, good athlete, lots of interest, family, all that kind of stuff. And he started taking an SSRI because he couldn't sleep. And it worked, and it was fine. But he goes to the doctor. It's like, I'm ready to stop now. And the doctor's like, why upset a good thing? Now, SSRIs they don't have tachyphylaxis. They're not strictly addictive where you need more and more of them. I'm wondering whether you find this kind of as a general theme, and whom is best served by this kind of persistent dictum that, it's a little bit like the rat motel, what is it, the roach motel? It's easier to get in, nobody leaves. How much of it is kind of personal capture? I mean, Starbucks has a great model. You go in for your coffee, and then you have a caffeine. I mean, probably started with one. You have a caffeine addiction, and you need to go back. How many branches of medicine are operating on the Starbucks model?
Yeah, Doc, I'm pretty radicalized on this. I've done a deep dive almost obsessively, probably the last 6-7 years of my life. I'm so far into the literature, into the fraud, the conflicts of interest, how we educate our medical professionals, and it's just the role of pharmaceutical marketing. Yeah, I see SSRIs as mitochondrial poison. I think we're under attack in American culture. I think that's quite obvious by the chronic disease epidemic and the mental health epidemic that we observe in our country. The side effects sometimes or the effect of mitochondrial poison can have some psychiatric benefits. So like emotional blunting is the primary reaction to a SSRI. And I can understand if somebody's in deep pain or they're looking for some form of relief, that emotional blunting in itself can feel like somewhat of a relief, maybe even get to sleep at night. But these drugs are dependent. They create dependency very quickly in ways that most doctors aren't educated. The drugs can have permanent adverse consequences, including post-SSRI sexual function. So that emotional blunting that takes place when you take an SSRI also affects the entire body. It dims the light within us, and it provides less of an experience and color of life, including positive emotions. The worst is being able to be permanently disabled by the drug due to its sexual dysfunction. But the idea that feeling less means that it's feeling better, or that somehow leads to a resolution or overcoming the challenge that exists when somebody is going through emotional struggles, is the lie that we've been sold, and we've been lied in order to increase profits for the pharmaceutical industry. Now, all the doctors are complicit in this because, you know, they've been trained under these narratives that have been sold to us that somehow if you're suffering, there's some biological abnormality that exists, like low serotonin. And if you target that at the brain level, you can increase the availability of serotonin, and that can provide somewhat of a boost in mood. And it stops right there. We don't study these drugs long-term. We don't look at the long-term effects, but it's very clear there's an increase in suicidality when you take those drugs. You take an episodic condition, you're going to make that person a chronic patient when you start taking an SSRI. It leads to a cascade of many other drugs, because you know how this works. The brain is always trying to find homeostasis. You need more of the drug to try to feel okay again, and then you require another drug and another drug, and now you're in the psychiatric system. And you can't tell me that that's not purposeful, because it creates patients who are surrendering their sovereignty and their autonomy to the medical system, and they no longer trust themselves. They're getting a war with their own emotional states and thoughts. They think they're genetically broken, when our emotional states are powerful energies. Going through difficult times in one's life is natural and part of this transformation process. And I think you just create a populace that's sedated and easily controllable. And that's why I think it's part of a much larger plan.
So you bring up a lot of fascinating points. I was having quote unquote brain changes while you were talking. You know, that's one of those things that gets said a lot. Well, their brain changes. One of my areas of expertise, possibly depending on whom you ask, is narcotic de-addiction. And so I have a book in galleys about how to. Its putative title is "Withdraw to Freedom," and it's getting out of the narcotic addiction maze. And I just as a quick, primer. You know, there are various substances to which people become addicted. Their habits, there's gambling and sex and, food and whatnot, which people say, they're addicted. But amongst the substances, let's say there's benzodiazepines, there's alcohol, so there's narcotics and whatnot. Only one of those we have replacement drug for. That's narcotic. We don't give, if somebody has a whiskey problem, we don't give them this nice clear water-like liquid called vodka, every day. And if somebody has a sex addiction, we don't, give them a prescription for a massage parlor 3 times a week. We pretty much tell those people to cut it out. Like the Bob Newhart. I don't know if you ever saw that episode. He's got a patient in. She's got a problem like, I don't know, OCD or whatever, and she's seen 15 psychiatrists. So he's like, oh, look, I've got something pretty short for you. Don't do that. Stop it. And it's kind of like the parental advice that people aren't getting. There's priests. There are various kind of religious pastors and priests and rabbis and whatnot, and then there's psychiatrists or psychologists, and the latter seem to have kind of lost the spine and oftentimes just say the things that people want to hear, and not necessarily getting out of their life struggle. So I think you're talking about various aspects of the thing we call life. There's all kinds of country songs about the pain and this and that, and I find them kind of palliative and soothing. Part of I grew up in New York City, so it's not really the heart of the country, music and whatnot. But there's aspects that we have kind of a song in our head of where we are and kind of the things that soothe us. Dancing and music make us feel better almost universally. Getting together and people can have their, it sounds really stupid, but they can have their frowns turned upside down. People in the right circumstances can, be happy. We are mimetic people. We see things, we do things. Monkeys see, monkey do. Well, we're not that far off per se. And I think a lot of this stuff kind of is as you mentioned, kind of self-serving to the, I'm not sure it's really as much the pharma industry as the psychiatry industry. I think it's more big psychiatry than big pharma, because I don't think there's that much profit margin on, a lot of the generic SSRIs. So to kind of give you a lead into a question here, have we? So the Greeks have the word telos. It's part of telegraphy and telemetry and telephones and telegraphs and whatnot. But it's basically the distant point, the point where we're supposed to be going, our raison d'être, the reason for being, so forth. What's the kind of underlying pathway that you're hoping that people will find, and can we get away from, I keep saying the word zoologic, but really it's a kind of a zookeeper formulation that we have, where people are kind of kept, they're kept safe, they're kept from harm, they have harm reduction and so forth. Is there a way that people can find their true selves and not, I don't know, jump off a cliff or whatever? I mean, what's the pathway and what are the results?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of this is cultural too. This is part of cultural conditioning and how we relate to our own internal experience. So first of all, once you start creating emotions or even thoughts as if they're symptoms of some greater problem, is that you're no longer being able to create that relationship where your emotions are there to serve you. And that's the difference in, I think, generations. It started to really shift over the course of my lifetime. I'm 49 years old, so I was able to see that shift throughout the 90s. I was always raised that our emotions are meant to serve us, that they're great indicators or signals, that there are events in our lives that we have to face, challenges we must overcome. And I saw that as a spiritual path. I still do. And therefore, when I feel those emotions that are aversive or difficult, they're telling me something very important. And I'm very comfortable with being able to feel them and get my clients to do the same thing. If you prevent people from their darkness, then you're also going to prevent them from their own light. And that's why I see this as very dark and even spiritual, which is the attack on human emotions as symptoms of a disease, because I see them as powerful energies. So the only way that we're going to make changes in American culture and we're going to get healthier is that we are able to accept and communicate aspects of our inner world and our collective humanity. Life is hard, and it's meant to be that way. But on the other side of that pain, on the other side of that heart, is often much needed change. I think people really find themselves in the most challenging and difficult moments of their lives. And what the medical system has done, the psychiatric establishment, which I say is very well tied to the pharmaceutical industry, is they believe that psychiatric treatment is getting people to be less human. I think it's an anti-human, transhumanist perspective and movement. That we're drugging people for grief. My goodness. Like, I think that should be a crime against humanity. Like, grief is that love for another person, and that intense loss is representative of something so beautiful of this human experience. And when you start to medicalize that and you provide drugs to mute that experience, you're creating illness. And I'm a big believer. I'm really into the literature base of psych neuroimmunology, and our experience emotionally is certainly implicated in our health. The more you try to suppress or blunt emotional energies and experiences, they have physiological effects. They have effects on the material, they have effects on the body. It's not like we can suppress what we're thinking and feeling. It doesn't affect us physically. It does. It affects our immune system. There's a whole field out there in biomedicine and cancer research where people are recognizing that the emotional states of people who are in periods of dis-ease are extremely important for their disease recovery. So I think it is certainly, I still believe it to be a targeted attack on the Western world when you talk about emotions from this perspective, and you are mass prescribing drugs and you are drugging your population. And it's even worse when you target the most vulnerable, which are children, women of childbearing years, pregnant women, because it's clear those drugs are affecting the fetus, the developing baby, especially in the first trimester. And I was just on an FDA panel for SSRIs for pregnancy, where, I mean, there's no doubt that that these drugs, SSRIs in particular, are affecting fetal brain development and organ development. And when you have an entire system that's pushing more drugs, even the most vulnerable time, you can't tell me that that's not purposeful and that's not dark.
So I'm going to leave that there for a second, because you listed a separate thought. I chat with younger people, some of my patients, and occasionally young women who are almost uniformly on the birth control pill. And some of them, kind of the more individualistic thinkers amongst them, have moved away. Part of this, it's not, there's always movements, there's a lot of, especially amongst young women, they're moving to veganism, they move to this, they're trying a lot of things on for size that I think are answering or attempting to answer some, malaise, some spiritual thing. I think we have a world of atomization where people aren't connecting in, say, maybe it was not necessarily perfect when it was a tribal society. Fine, I get that. I'm not sure where the happy medium was, but it seems right now we have, kind of a not quite a literal, but metaphorical war between the sexes. There's a lot of speed dating and worse and whatnot. And these women, might historically amongst my grandparents or great grandparents era, be married and starting families and kind of have different goals and whatnot. And they're not all necessarily geared for entering the 9 to 5, the movie, the workforce, and becoming I don't know, super attorney or head of the UN or something like that. And a lot of them want to settle down, but they can't. And on the pill, they felt, and I've heard this from a number of people, they felt blunted, that they don't have the full range of emotion when they're off the birth control pill, which is not a psychiatric drug per se, but it kind of has a tighter bandwidth of hormones, literally, and your emotions potentially. They have more of the highs and the lows, and they feel more authentic, as it were.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you have had any, passing thoughts or experiences on that particular topic, and whether, if not, whether it analogizes to the other ones about SSRIs.
Yeah, I do believe that the further we get away from our connection to nature, the sicker we become. And that involves all synthetic chemicals that alter the body. So it's very clear, the research literature on hormonal birth control and its impact on mood. It affects the brain. It affects pair bonding, the choice of partner. These are synthetic chemicals. They're altering your state. We see adverse reactions to hormonal birth control leading to SSRI prescriptions. Women are not educated on the dangers of hormonal birth control. But I do think, like, when we talk society, generally, in trying to understand the malaise and the emptiness that exists, is that we are more disconnected from our true nature, and we're more disconnected from each other than any other point in history. And has a very rapid and negative effect on our state of being. It's not fulfilling for us to relate through screens. It's not fulfilling for us to be disconnected from nature, eating fake food, involved in fake relationships. It creates an anxiety, an emptiness, a feeling of distress. We're away from what is, I think, our natural intuition is to serve. Our natural intuition is to connect with each other. I think men and women are inherently unhappy with a number of aspects of American life and American culture that have economic roots to them. Men and women aren't able to survive on one income. It's very difficult for families to survive on one income, which impacts when they start getting married or when they start getting serious about relationships, because you bring a lot of debt. There's a lot of people who are not designed to contribute to corporate America. And their natural intuition is to have a family or to be a parent. And the more you disconnect it from all these aspects that make life worth living and allow for the flourishing of any society and culture, I think the sicker we become emotionally, mentally, and physically. And the root causes of the disease, chronic disease epidemic in the United States is multifaceted. Like, it's not just synthetic dyes, it's not just synthetic chemicals, fake food, it's not just pharmaceuticals, it's also this economic aspect and spiritual connectedness that we really have lost, that we're no longer in touch with ourselves. And now we're looking for quick pleasures that exist, right? Like use of phone. There's free pornography that's pushed on us. It's Netflix. It's a constant distraction. And that ultimately leads just to such a degree of emptiness.
It's there's an old joke, once you can fake humility, you've got it made. The trick is from people to get from A to B. Neon lights actually operate on quantum mechanics in a sense. The lights gets excited and then it jumps from one phase to the next. You electrically charge it up, and then dropping down, it forms light. That's a big leap. Humans don't have that quality. We can't go from no excitation to excitation and give off light. The trick, again, for my narcotic addicts was to get from A to B. I had almost uniquely, it seems, retrospectively, I had a unique program of like 4.5 months or so of tapering, because I decided that was the grief cycle. And people really are not, you lose a dog, a spouse, parent, whatever, God forbid a child, it's 4.5 months or so before you can really see and think clearly. And so I was using that as kind of like the Goldilocks principle, not too long, which is forever maintenance, and not too short, which is 3 to 5, 7 days, 10 days, whatever, which kind of, leads like what they call a spin cycle. People go back and forth and into detox and whatnot. But, for the people who are not there yet, and they're not, excited, they're depressed, say, they're the light bulb that hasn't turned on. Now, speaking of which, is a great joke. How many psychiatrists or psychologists, I guess, does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to really, really want to be changed. So presumably, you're seeing people who want to be changed in the individual aspect for your practice and whatnot. But is it enough to tell people they should have fulfillment through family, whatever, when maybe that's how they got there in the first place? They're not good at that. They're not connectors. They're not, as Larry David says in one episode, a middler. They're not the person at the dinner table who can, ping pong conversation back and forth and be adept and, juggle tasks and whatnot. Where do we go with that? I mean, do you say, oh, just start a family? People may be beyond the age they can do that, whatever. How do people connect who aren't connected?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that's what I love about my work. My work is I never get to meet the same person twice. And the intimacy of it and the natural process that you're able to evolve through when you develop a relationship with someone and you're doing therapy with somebody is you're getting somebody to get more connected to themselves again. And so remember, I'll take it back to what I said earlier on this show, is that I do believe our emotional states are signals, and they're indicators of aspects of our life that we have to face and overcome. So that process of knowing what are your unhappiness or your depression or what's going on with you emotionally, what is that trying to teach you, right? Pain is an ultimate teacher. And what leads to a life worth living is independent. Each person has a spark in them, a spirit in them. They're called to live a certain life. And when you're off that path, you're going to be bombarded, in my opinion, with emotional challenges because your soul is not supposed to be where it is. So you can enter into bad relationships, the wrong line of work. You could be living life for somebody else, which often happens. Like, we are very mass conditioned and controlled in American society from the day we enter into our school system, for one. We're all told about who we should be or the life we should live. And it leads to people following paths that are not necessarily connected to who they truly are. And so I think one of the primary goals is that trying to figure out who you are again and being able to determine how can you live a life that's purposeful, that's with meaning, that's in service, where do you find enjoyment? Where do you feel like that light, that spark of light is being ignited again in your life? And I've never met anyone who didn't experience that. I've met with people who wanted to end their life, who are in the depths of depression. But even in those states, when you can get them out of their mind and you can connect to their life, everybody can go back and understand where they turned off on that path, where they're living a life that doesn't fit who they're supposed to be. And I think that's the beauty of the work that I do, is that you move away from these labels, like your disease, like it's happening to you. You move away from these social constructions, or whatever the narrative is, that ego narrative that is kind of just this rolling tape in your mind. And you realize, what have you been running away from? What have you been escaping from? That could be from drugs, that could be alcohol, that could be food. That could be all types of problem behaviors that people engage into to escape their own internal experience. So when you're going to try to live a life where you're no longer escaping, well, then you're facing the darkness. And in that darkness is where you find clarity. That is where you find your light. That's when you get to know who you are. We have to get back to those messages in our culture. We're resilient people. We are very resilient people. And it is only the messages that want to create this version of us that we're small and we're diseased and we're sick and we're chemically imbalanced and we have to be managed. Like, that's what the mental health industry has become. Like, you manage your patients, right? You manage their anxiety. You manage them with drugs. They become so much less than what their light is really meant for them to be. And that's bullshit. And I get out of that kind of mindset very quickly with my clients. And then that's where I think I have better outcomes than the typical person, is because there's a relationship that's built. There's a connection. We are relational beings. And in that relationship, and if you're not going to be afraid of the darkness, if you're not going to be afraid of the pain, then you're willing to experience it. You're going to move that energy. And I believe you're going to find yourself. And that's where we've gone wrong in the mental health industrial complex, is that we've turned it into a system where we're labeling, diagnosing, drugging, and creating realities for people.
So, like the answer to almost every question is it depends. And so, just to give a little devil's advocate here, we all are creatures of our selection bias. The 7 blind men and the elephant, each one has a different feel of the elephant, and one comes back thinks it's like a tree trunk, the other one thinks it's like a carpet, because the one has the leg and one has the ear, and then one has the tail. So they all have a different conception of what the elephant is. Almost ipso facto, you're going to be seeing, say, not schizophrenics. They probably have pre-banded and post-bonded with a psychiatrist, and they're in a certain line of treatment. I took enough psychiatry and saw enough, I think, schizophrenics to have a sense of who and what they are. Psychiatry, is a little bit, you validly brought up in your interview with Ragi Girgis, Columbia Psychiatry, kind of the limitations of psychiatric diagnosis. It's not as easy as what Isaac Newton had to do, dropping, having the apple fall on his head or something like that. It's not as reproducible because we aren't, we can't run multiple trials of ourselves, and we can't do counterfactual, go back in time and do anything. So it's very difficult with people. So in the realm of people that you see, what is the type of person you see? What's the type of referral? And then we can, talk about, say, the not schizophrenics and the, maybe bipolar, ADD, and all the kind of things that maybe you are seeing, and how does it work with or without medication, and OCD or whatever, all these kind of labels that get bandied about.
Yeah, and I'm going to want to address first your point on schizophrenia, because the Western medicine's treatment outcomes for schizophrenia are much, much worse than other countries around the world. For example, we do a horrible job of treating schizophrenia in the United States. We don't understand it. It's still a mystery on why someone becomes schizophrenic. And the way we respond to schizophrenia with antipsychotic drugs and mood stabilizing, a cocktail of polypharmacy, ends up creating a level of sickness and disease in that individual that is extremely debilitating. So I look at other, like Finland has the open dialogue program, which allows people to respond to initial psychotic episodes in different ways. Other cultures do this as well. As if there is a disconnection from reality, for example, and there's a delusion or a hallucination, when cultures respond to that in terms of attaching meaning to it, of understanding that it could be an extreme stress reaction, understanding there could be many other factors that lead human beings to enter into that state, including severe nutritional deficiencies, response to trauma, lack of light, extreme response to stress. When you take a more holistic viewpoint, you have much better recoveries. So yes, I do not treat schizophrenia, but I've certainly treated people in psychotic episodes that would later get labeled as schizophrenia. Well, when does that happen? My caseload is very focused at this point with working with people who are in the most severe emotional and mental states, often post-trauma, so PTSD, severe depression, and I have a background and I've published and conducted research on the treatment of eating disorders. I think they're all interrelated. I think when I often see somebody go into anorexia in response to a stressful event. So they lose their appetite and they have retreated and they end up losing a ton of weight. And I think it triggers a mechanism that is evolutionarily designed that puts them in a state of fear, probably in a response to previous history epigenetically related to famine. And someone can get very, very sick into anorexia, but often that's in a response to other previous events. So I try to think about this thing from multiple perspectives. There's always a function to all human behavior. And I have to understand what that function is and what that reaction is. Like we're seeing even right now in metabolic psychiatry that we're seeing people improve when we just target with a ketogenic diet. That gives us some indication that there's something happening metabolically in some people who have the most extreme symptoms. Remember, bipolar in itself is still just a label. It's not this discrete identifiable condition that we do a blood test for or a brain scan for. We just know the human propensity is that someone can enter into mania. And some people can have a wide variety of mood swings. If you look back into the historical data and research, pre-drug era, like back into the 50s, and you look at psychiatric hospitalizations for bipolar 1 disorder, manic depressive illness, and you look at recovery rates, for example, something like 85% of people would have one episode. They would recover. There wouldn't be further hospitalizations. They would return back to previous functioning. This would include being married and working. So what is happening in modern society that our outcomes are so poor? We give somebody a bipolar diagnosis. We provide them a series of cocktails of drugs that I think are then putting them into a state of sickness and disease that is absolutely assuring that they're going to have further relapse into these conditions that we're mislabeling as just part of their illness. I think we're missing the boat on understanding circadian rhythms and light exposure and environmental toxins and a number of things that in fact impact human behavior. And that's my biggest problem with psychiatry is it's an illegitimate authority. There's no scientific basis that supports its place in our healthcare system. Then you add into the degree that they can take away individual liberties and freedoms. So somebody has some episode in which they're struggling. They have the ability to take away your freedom, assign a pseudoscientific label as a DSM diagnosis, take away all your rights and imprison you in a hospital. And if you see what psychiatric hospitals look like, it is prison. Are you going out and getting nature? Are you getting good food? No, you're locked up in a facility that has no windows for the most part. You're being drugged into a sedative state. You have to play a game in order to get out of there. And you eat horrible food. You're taken away from your family and your support system. all indications are that's the last thing we would want to do for somebody who's struggling. Someone who's struggling needs time, probably connected to nature, being taken care of, some rest, good food, hydration, understanding what the stressors were. Instead, we'll take somebody who's, some of them in a violent relationship after a sexual assault, a serviceman returning from combat. They'll have an episode, and then we're gonna treat them less than human. The entire treatment paradigm and the profession is built, in my opinion, on a bedrock of fraud and misrepresentation of actually what is happening. Those labels in themselves are dangerous. It's one of the American institutions that definitely has to be rebuilt, and I'm going to try to be part of that. Developing like parallel institutions with new ideas and better science.
So, there's a lot there. One thing though I think might be missing is, the effects somebody with mental illness might have on somebody else. There's a lot of people want to do prison reform, for instance. I'm not saying this is analogous, but you commit a crime. It's like, oh, I literally had an intern, not a medical intern, but I was running a small business tech firm between my roles in medicine, and he was a great guy. You'd want your daughter to marry him. He's a nice-looking kid and went to college over in the UK, and very polite and so forth. But he thought there should be no prisons. And I said, well, God forbid that somebody like hurts your sister, hurts your mother, whatever. What are you going to do? Chit chat about it? Somebody comes out of the blue and terrorizes whatever, or any of these horrible things I'm not going to mention that might happen. That person has, you're not going to converse that person and have him reverse if he's perverse. And it's like that's not workable. It's in your mind. And even if you think you're this kind of great Swami guru type that can, has the personality to do it, that's not necessarily reproducible across the entire prison reform system and so forth, or prison system in general. And as far as, certain illnesses, there's a lot of secondary harm, specifically from schizophrenics who act out. I don't think they're the big portion of mass shootings, as, that was the topic of your Gerges encounter and whatnot. Leaving that kind of stuff aside, people can be very damaging. And to themselves. I having kind of worked a little bit in psychiatry, we don't kind of go out and collect souls out on the street and corral them. Generally they self-proclaim as wanting to kill themselves or kill somebody else. And this, we don't have a perfect system. And yeah, sure, there's going to be an aspect of prison for psychiatry if you want to hurt other people. So there is that kind of equation we always, and from a liability standpoint, you can't put somebody out on the street where there's going to be some secondary harm. That would be the ruination of any psychiatric career and probably psychology career. And so let's stipulate that you are a good psychologist and you clearly have passion and care, and you have a direction of vision and focus. Absent retroactive cloning, we're not going to find a lot of you out there. I'm imagining there's one of you. Possibly twins. And how are we going to, template your concept to the system in general, and how well does it, take into account secondary harm?
Yep. So yeah, I have my solutions to this. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of people that are placed in a psychiatric hospital are not in the danger of harming somebody else. Okay. We are pushing people into the psychiatric hospital for having thoughts of suicide. And that doesn't even mean that they're suicidal. Having thoughts of suicide. It's a fear-based system, so we're driving a lot of people in there. The degree of people the percentage of people that are actually schizophrenic, unable to function, historically has been much smaller than what it is now. People go out into the streets and they see the homeless. A lot of that is drug addiction, substance abuse, extreme poverty. So there's a lot that's happening there that provokes fear of the American people of the other. But the truth of the matter is, you are right. There are some people who are dangerous to themselves and to other people in society. That's why there needs to be prison systems, and that's why there also needs to be psychiatric facilities that actually can protect somebody from themselves, and we need to be able to protect the community when that exists. Now, here's how this is how people can actually recover from these conditions. There's something called Soteria houses. Have you heard of Soteria houses?
No.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably best related to the previous mental institutions that existed in the United States in the 20th century on these sprawling grounds connected to nature, where they had adequate periods of time to be able to be outside, to get rest, to get good food, and get support. Soteria House is a very similar model, is that you take people, you put them into nature. This is schizophrenia, for example, very low functioning like schizophrenia or thought disorders of things of that nature. They get good food, they get support. We see much higher recovery rates. Like the human capacity to be able to recover from the effects of extreme stress, and even to enter into these psychiatric states, hallucinations, delusions, psychotic episodes, is much better than we have been told in the United States. So this medical model where we call it an illness and we tell people that they're going to be like this forever and they need to be on drugs just to manage it is a lie. It's not scientifically accurate. And then so we create in fear. We tell people and their families they have a brain illness, that they have to be on these drugs, and then these drugs are what creates stability. That's not true. And the scientific literature doesn't support that. Actually, we've created chronic conditions from the drugs. The people hate taking the drugs because it makes them feel absolutely sick. We create metabolic illness. They become an absolute shell of their former selves and become a burden on their families after it. Talk to families who've been in the system and what happens when they enter into psychiatry and they go by their models and they go by their science. Before they know it, they have a family member who's on 7 drugs, is drooling and staring at the TV all day.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of that. I mean, I ran a primary care office in a kind of blue collar town next to Boston, and there was a guy who was kind of probably minimally functioning. I wrote an article recently on autism, totally separate topic. It's called Unraveling Autism Surge, which I think it does figure out, we hear about this autism epidemic. Anyway, 100 years ago, they had these literal gradations with words we can't even use practically now: imbecile, moron, and they had low grade imbecile. Anyway, there was a kind of gradation. So he wasn't the sharpest tool in the drawer to begin with. He was living with his mom, and probably a simple guy. Had worked a few different jobs, whatever. At one point, he got into the psychiatric world, and he was already adult. He's probably 50 or so, and his mom was elderly. And I would see them both often for whatever reason, mostly her, but he'd come along. Anyway, one day he came in. He was, he looked like he'd been on the wrong end of a professional boxing match, but no bruises. He just couldn't talk. He couldn't form words. He had, slowness. There was drool literally coming out of the side of his mouth. And he had a close encounter of the third kind, with psychiatry.
Yeah.
And it was just, I couldn't get him unglued from that because, the mom, had been listening to psychiatrists. But I think what had happened, I can remember specifically, it doesn't really matter. He was kind of an arid kind of guy. He had fast movements, and he was a long, skinny man, and he had perilously jaywalked, and so he'd been hit and nothing broken, but he wound up in the hospital, and that's when they just kind of found a right plumb there, and they started working on him. So he was recovering from his wounds, and they just, he came out of that, bones intact, but mentally not. I mean, it's an extreme singular example, but there are times when it just, people don't know the before and after. They don't have a sense of who that person is, and a little bit of like the namelessness, aspect of I used the word before, an atomized society. People are just not connected. They don't have the support. And to it, I mean, I'm going to tack on one other thing here. When I started doing my autism study, and I came in pretty cold because I went to medical school back in the Paleozoic, and we didn't really have the term, seriously, we didn't have the term autism then. It existed, but we didn't see any, we spent time in psychiatric wards and this and that, and we didn't see any cases named autism. This is kind of a very recent, formulation. I mean, it's a rehashing and a recirculation of an older term, which was misapplied. Anyway, the word autism actually meant something 180 degrees from what it is now 100 years ago. Anyway, but while I was doing that, I was noticing that they don't really have a term of art for autism in certain places on Earth. Like, there are autism studies, but if you look throughout Africa, there's 1 billion people, there's like literally zero articles on autism throughout Africa, maybe a little bit to South Africa, whatever, but most of Africa, nothing. China has a much lower rate of autism than we do because they shun it. They don't want to give it to people. And, I think, one of the things I'm kind of hinting at, and I got a little, sensibility about this without firm diagnosis, is that in certain places, there might be the same set of people, but they don't get labeled the same way. And they might fit in a different way. If you happen to be, of that autistic stripe in the middle of, I don't know, Uganda or something like that, well, you know what, get back to work, push that boulder, rake the street. We're not really that interested. But here we have a lot more free time. We have a, much more, I guess, computer and, technical world, and less of the physical labor stuff. And are we just kind of miscasting people, expecting them all to be like accountants when some of them should be sweeping the streets? And we don't really have that. A lot of the things that would be have been mechanized away from human work.
Yeah, it's an interesting point and a good question. And I've thought deeply about things of this nature, including the impact of labels or what we create in consciousness. So when there's a collective consciousness that's created around any sort of limitation of human potential, let's just use the word clinical depression. Clinical depression wasn't something that was part of American lexicon to the extent prior to 1985. Like, if you start going back into the literature post World War II, previous to World War II, we just didn't use the word. It didn't exist. So then it changed the way that people not only understood themselves, but how they related and understood each other. There was something called melancholia, which I guess would be the severe form of what we would call depression today. But it was so rare that in all likelihood, you'd never come across anybody in your life who experienced it. But it was a severe form of demoralization. It was like someone who just completely gave up on living, was demoralized, and it was a state of intense despair. Maybe you'd see it as a severe reaction to loss. Fast forward to where we are now, we've created this idea in consciousness. Now everyone is depressed. Like 30%, it's impossible. How 30% of the population identify themselves to be severely depressed? Same thing with things like ADHD. ADHD has devolved into a personal identity in which it filters their entire world. They see every challenge or struggle through this lens that they have a broken brain. And now there's even like a protective nature to it. Every relationship that didn't work out, every loss of a job, every struggle interpersonally now can be related back to this mysterious condition that you have. And instead, it really stops you from growth. Now you're just an ADHD person. You can't help it. And we've created that in collective consciousness, and it serves an entire industry. It serves an apparatus where there's certainly financial gain and incentive for the more people that can identify as ADHD, the more doctors that can serve them, the more therapists can serve them, and the more drugs can be sold. And these. You understand what I'm talking about. So
it's the self-serving aspect. I agree.
Yeah.
I think the ADHD is a good example. And as far as excuses, I had a regular medical practice, but in the 2000s, the Suboxone came along, and I started doing the detox I mentioned. And I had a lot of people who woulda, shoulda, coulda. There's a famous Marlon Brando line, I could have been a contender, but for the fact I did this. And so a lot of people, they could have been this, they could have been a major league pitcher, whatever, but the drug. So they kind of had this convenient out, but they never measured up. I mean, it's easy enough to say, I could have, been a doctor, I could have been this. It's much harder to actually go through and do it all. I mean, I can say that as a matter of fact. I mean, I'm probably smart enough, maybe smarter than the average bear, but it was hard. It's a lot of work, and I'm not sure, I would do it again if I had to do it again. And it's, but it's easy once you say, oh, well, I could have been that. I could have been this. I could have been a great movie actor, whatever, except for the fact that I'm, I look like this. But anyway, but oftentimes the drugs. As far as the ADHD thing, getting back to my kind of tech mini career in the 20 teens, I had a guy I really loved. He was a brilliant guy, but he was very enamored with his own ADHD diagnosis, and he was almost literally menstrual in the sense of the monthly aspect. He had like one good week. He was like knocking it out of the park, doing crazy great work. One kind of frazzled week. 1 week he wasn't there, and then the next week come back exhausted, and then rinse. What is it? Lather, rinse, repeat. It was just, and it turns out that he was on this ADD medication thing. So he'd be sped up, and he had this great week when. And anyway, the sick week was when he stopped and he was off it. And he'd come back groggy, then he started. Anyway, it was like clearly this stuff had an effect, but overall, in the if you kind of zoom out, it was not a good effect. The one really awesome, maybe 10, 12 days of really good work were counterbalanced by the fact that he was inaccessible. And it didn't dawn on me, right? It's not like he said this at the beginning. It's only after like 5 or 6 of these cycles, I'm like, what is this? And it turns out it was, he was medication cycling and, tweaking or whatever. I don't know. So I don't know if you want to talk about kind of the ADD formulation, the association with the validity of medications thereof, and maybe, we can kind of verge into concepts of what other kind of tweaking people do. They tweak with psychedelics. They're looking at ketamine to get rid of depression. I don't know if you have any thoughts about any of those things.
I do. It's interesting. There's a statement that I use, and it's from quantum physics, actually, that we are creators of our own reality. So I think this idea that what exists in our mind is our reality, and that's why it's difficult for sometimes to be able to relate and adapt to other human beings, because we're literally living in different worlds. So there's so much complexity to the inner world and experience of the person. So how they view their experience and how they view their life is very meaningful for the choices and decisions they make. For example, cycling drugs for productivity purposes, or seeking out a shift in consciousness through psychedelics or so forth. One of the things that I can speak to on like where we're going as a mental health industry is I'm concerned about the commercialization of psychedelics. It's certainly going, once the pharmaceutical industry tries to play a major role in this, you're taking something that definitely has benefits, that's in nature, that cultures have been using in a ceremonial way for a certain purpose of conscious expansion of understanding, of connection to all things in nature that seem to serve people. And now you're turning it into a treatment. So you're medicalizing, again, all aspects of the human experience. I think for the most part, ADHD, where what we label as ADHD, remember, that's not a discrete illness. Again, it's just a constellation of symptoms, has so many different causes, right? What I do right now is, one of the first things I do in initial evaluation, I ask people to take out their phone and then to show me what their daily screen time is on that phone. Do you know what I'm finding?
More than a larger number than their sleep.
I'm seeing like 8 to 12 hours a day on that phone. How are you supposed to direct your attention into other things and be able to tolerate boredom or just sitting with yourself when your brain is constantly being stimulated by that device. I think our brains, generally speaking, are working exactly how they're designed to do for most people. And even like these personality shifts of the energetic, male, or the person who has who struggles to focus their attention on just one thing, likely has evolutionary benefits to it, right? You see these people, they have ADHD, but they can play video games for hours on end with intense focus. There's just a variability that exists in all of human nature. And when you try to form an understanding of human behavior from a limited lens of normality, well, then you're going to be identifying a lot of people who skew outside that. When you add disorder onto it and you say it needs to be treated medically, that's when you start creating an entire culture of people who have these labels and are turning the medical system to resolve that, with abject failure. I mean, it's been an absolute failure. And then the level of normality continues to shrink, because the more people that are disordered, the more people that we can label, well, then an entire system can benefit from it. Even a system that has political motives of division and control, for example. So I think it's a complex discussion. I mean, we could probably do 3 hours, on that in so many different ways.
We're going to have to invite Lex Friedman in on that. No, I think he has a patent on the 3-hour interview. I don't know if Joe Rogan has. So I don't want to put as they say in England, a spanner in the works, monkey wrench, that is, in the gears. But you talk about kind of the natural aspect, and I have sympathy for that, because it's been said I'm a human being and born of parents and all that kind of stuff, like many other people. What's up with gender dysphoria, and how do you kind of categorize that model within the terms you've used for the psychiatric, or maybe you said mental health, medical, complex, whatever you want to call it. Is this kind of another aspect of patient acquisition? Are we helping people find their true selves, or are we abusing their concept for whatever other political, social, psychiatric, profitable purposes?
It's a psychological operation that was. I mean, it's very clear it's a psyop. You can go back to its origins. I'll tell you this: it's a social contagion effect. So, a social contagion effect. It's real. It's measurable, and you can institute that. You can create that in a population. What you do is you take vulnerable people, which is adolescence, a time of distinct identity development, and if people are also struggling emotionally, or potentially even drugged, it's very easy to create an alternative reality of who they are. Okay. There are only two sexes. Only two sexes exist. The idea that gender is a construct where people have masculine and feminine features, all people, right? So if you want to really brainwash and confuse somebody, so you take a male who has feminine qualities or a feminine energy, and then you tell them, well, that means you're a girl. And you take a girl who has some masculine features and you really confuse them, and you tell them that means you're a boy, and there is no male or female. And you can push that on society, and invulnerable people seek out community. And if it's flooded on social media, it's flooded in American culture, it's pushed into American schools, it's pushed on the media, you create that social contagion, and you're going to capture a percentage of people. And when you do that is then there's all different ways you can take over a culture when those ideas flourish and they spread like wildfire. You've seen it in our own political system, right? It's now of all the things that we should be focusing on when electing political officials in this country, now gender dysphoria and trans ideology is now at the forefront of how we make decisions on who we elect. And the entire system. This goes back to why I think we're under attack. You know, if you can confuse a population to the extent that you no longer know what male and female is, you're easily controllable.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I think you had that. Gonna probably get his name wrong, but Yuri Beramazov or something like that. The turned KGB guy who talked about how the communists aim to upend society. Maybe correct me on my stab at his name, but yeah, it seems kind of like a way. You know, I think the important distinction here is that psychiatry, for instance, often sees people as individuals, which, I mean, we're individual, but, you know, taking the person out of the context and somehow, again, atomizing, you know, separating into individuals, that person, kind of cutting away from the tribe weakens him. And I think we have to kind of figure out ways of, I'm not a socialist, but I do like social activities. And I do think we are social animals and social being. I think socialism is one of those things that sounds nice. It's not really that social. You know, it's like Social Security is neither secure nor social. And socialism isn't that social either when it, you know, kind of preys upon people, takes their possessions and has them, you know, conform to a certain type of way of being, whether it's national socialism or international socialism, communism, and so forth. But anyway, but it seems, you know, it's a hard thing to kind of put back in the bottle, but I'll just put this little factoid out there. When I was researching my methadone article for brownstone.org, you know, my stipulation is that, you know, the narcotic addiction, the opioid epidemic, was not a product of OxyContin. It's not a product of fentanyl. Those things are adding a little bit of fuel to a pre-existing fire. And the fire really came about with a paradigm shift out of Rockefeller University towards this treatment model, the methadone maintenance model. But you know, it's like I'm kind of getting lost in my own thoughts here. But you know, we have taken out of context the fact that people, you know, need to operate, you know, more in their jobs. Oh, I know the factoid I was going to bring up was in researching that. I found that, you know, the opioid epidemic, the number of opioid deaths had increased year by year since the 1990s and beyond. And the only time it stopped was during Donald Trump's first 3 years in office. And that was because he had brought back manufacturing jobs to the Midwest. So the OxyContin crisis disappeared. Nobody talked about the fact that he had, quote unquote, cured the opioid epidemic because they don't want to give him credit and so forth. But it comes down to a simple fact that I think people had things to do. You know, people don't, the worst punishment you can get in prison is solitary confinement. And one of the worst punishments you can have as a person, especially a man, is to be devoid of a job. You don't have this telos thing. You don't have the place to go, the who you are. You know, we dissolve, our egos dissolve, you know, not quite out in the water in the rain, but in the absence of the appreciation, the reflections that we get by being and doing certain things.
Yeah, well said. I mean, you were referring to Yuri Bezmenov, who was a KGB defector to the United States, and he spoke about that blueprint. And the first part of the blueprint is demoralization, and it was his belief that it takes about 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. And I think one way you do that is you do strip them of their own personal agency, and you get them to no longer trust that kind of inner guidance. And you find ways to divide the country by creating enemies and others and so forth. I do see the demoralization of the United States being multiple pronged, but eventually you start giving up your own mind, your own sovereignty to the state or to the expert. And I mean, that was breeding ground for how we would respond to COVID. You know, so many people gave up their personal agency and sovereignty to the state and were willing to voluntarily inject themselves with technology without knowing anything about it. In fact, all they have to hear the word is that it's a vaccine. They don't know anything about the technology, what it's going to do, what the long-term effects are. we're so demoralized as a country, we just hand over our sovereignty to the state. This is a direct result of I think the psychological operation that has occurred through our entire lives, and it's been a slow drip to the point where you have what exists right now, which is a mental health crisis, because people can't even trust their own emotional states and their own minds, and they're willing to, again, voluntarily go on mind and mood altering drugs. Like that, those are the larger questions. How did we get to a point where we voluntarily give up our freedom, our sovereignty, and inject ourselves with what can amount to be toxins and poisons to our entire body? And that is the power of psychological manipulation and brainwashing. And we have to accept that we're susceptible to it. There's certainly plenty of people who are less susceptible to it. They were dissidents during COVID. They fight now, they fight currently, because we're not going to give up our minds. We're not going to give them up to AI. We're not going to give them up to the US government. We're not going to give it up to any social ideology. It's going to be within us. We're going to maintain our individual sovereignty. We're going to be critical thinkers. We know what it takes to live well. That's in health. That's in service. That's in connection to God. And those are three values that are important to me. When those things exist, you're not controllable. Yeah. And that's what they totally fear.
Agree. I was, I kind of feel as if, the shape of our discussion, was forming religion, that there's some kind of other framework that people, need to have. That being said, there are, I think, better and worse religions out there. I mean, it depends, Yeah. When that mass shooting conversation you had, I didn't get to follow through the whole thing, but I was wondering whether he was going to touch on Islam, which is something that nobody wants to touch on. I mean, the kind of derivation of his name, I don't know who he is exactly, but Raji Gurgis, my understanding is it's kind of an Egyptian Copt name, and the Copts have left Egypt in large regard because of the Muslim Brotherhood and whatnot. And things blow up. It's not that every Muslim blows things up, but every time something blows up, it's a good chance it's been from Islam. And so I've been in the practice of recommending for my narcotic addicts that try to find faith. I have what I call the 5 F's. It was family, faith, funds, which is work, getting job, friends, and then only lastly fun. That's a secondary that comes from those other ones. And faith, I was, I'm not really partisan about that kind of thing. But I think people do well to be part of community. Now, that can be kind of taken to the wrong extreme, as we've seen. So it's like I'm not going to ready to go back to the drawing board on that, but I think there is kind of, people have to make decisions about that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, formalized religion can also be part of authoritarian control as well. Formal religion has done harm throughout the course of human history. It could be another control apparatus that operates in fear and control, and it's a source of wars and a number of things. I separate that from, faith, which is, across religions, there are certain commonalities around forgiveness and connection to the divine, and a sense of purpose and love and service of others. And that's where the global community can kind of connect, is under those same principles. All major religions are essentially nonviolent. How do we get controlled to be violent, to do harm on our brothers and sisters? Like, those things are interesting because they're also how, manipulation can take place and can capture the minds of large groups of people and radicalize them to act against what is that nature of what that religion is to begin with. But you just go back to, you make a great point of those F's, those 5 F's. Those are all critically important to the human experience and human flourishing and health. There's no doubt about it.
So we basically over-rounded our hour. So I don't want to take up your entire day. I want people to be able to find you so I can, recommend them, our listeners and viewers, to your pages. This is the Radically Genuine Substack you have, and you have as well page on X, coincident with your name, Dr. McFillin, and you've got a couple other things here, your Substack, and I'm not sure what the collective.org is, but why don't we click and find out? So you can maybe tell us a little about that, and
sure.
People can try to connect with you and your podcast. So did I not put it up there? I'm sorry. It must be on just one page. I'm sorry. I'll see if I can pull it up in the meanwhile. Get the other page up.
Yeah, so you can certainly find me on X at Dr. McFillin, and then I've the Radically Genuine podcast and the Radically Genuine Substack. The Radically Genuine Substack, the last I looked, it was number 3 on rising publications for health politics. It's a bestseller for health politics. The Radically Genuine podcast is in the top 0.5% of global downloads. So these are important conversations that I think people are interested in globally. And the Conscious Clinician Collective, which is what you had up there, is I started a nonprofit because people were reaching out to me. Where do I find a mental health professional who will respect my individual autonomy, provide informed consent, and not just push us to diagnoses and drugs? So we created a Conscious Clinician Compact, which is really a declaration, and we're trying to build a database of healthcare practitioners who support medical freedom and informed consent. So if you are struggling with your mental health, you don't have to go in there in fear that all they're going to do is label you with a pseudoscientific diagnosis and try to push drugs on you. That instead they might see it as, hey, there are root causes to this that we might want to investigate medically, for example. But also these could be valid indicators of different struggles in your life that you have to face. And we shouldn't have to medicalize you and professionalize this to an extent where now you're provided this diagnosis, it's part of your medical record, and now it biases everyone who sees you down the line. So this is my attempt to try to create a network and to support people's individual freedom and autonomy outside of those labels.
That's really crucial. So I play some sports, squash and tennis and whatnot. I belong to a couple of clubs. And professionally as well, I meet psychiatrists, psychologists, and so forth. There was a point where somebody from out of state was asking me, based on one of my podcasts, how can I find somebody? I know somebody in Massachusetts who's having, getting this kind of gender stuff in the schools, and they sent the child to a school psychologist, and everything's kind of being pushed in a certain way. Can you please get me somebody who's at least skeptical about this? So I asked around all my psychology buddies and whatnot, and they couldn't come up with anybody, including themselves.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's weird because at least one person drinks out of a mug that's the Harvard Center for Bioethics, and literally, and I feel as if bioethics has just become finger in the air. Like whichever way the wind is blowing, that's what is bioethics today, and maybe where the money is as well. And hopefully the wind will blow another way, but it's kind of sad they don't really have any grounding. And it kind of gets to my point about religion versus psychiatry, or some of these, psychological aspects where people are getting paid. And I don't know if you ever remember, I don't know if you saw Ozark or not. Are you familiar with the psychologist scene in Ozark?
No.
So Jason Bateman, he's got a lot of money, but a lot of problems, and the wife and he fight, and she's not going to do it unless they go to see a therapist. He doesn't want to have the therapist say things that are counter to his interests, which, frankly, most of the therapists these days are women, and that it's kind of like a team sport, and the guys are disfavored and whatnot. So, they're doing this therapy, and surprisingly, the therapist is siding with him about a lot of stuff. Anyway, on the side, he's been shuttling her $1,000 extra per session, that she'll do what he says. He writes out the list of things he wants to have done in that session, and that's what happens. Anyway, so I feel like the bioethics part is there's not much spine there, sadly, and for psychology and psychiatry has so abandoned this concept of working through your problems, and when gay became a thing, it's I'm born this way. Well, now it's you're born this way, but it's born the wrong way. Pick a lane. I think those ideas are somewhat inimical, and I think we're kind of lost track of some of the foundational aspects, civilizationally, societally, and so forth. I don't know if you want to put some last words on that. But I'll give
Yeah,
it to you.
my final comment on that is the therapy industry. So if you look how therapists are being trained currently, there's a lot of ideological indoctrination. When there's something called social justice theoretical orientation, you can understand that that is an ideological indoctrination when therapists have to put their pronouns up in their signature lines. It just becomes a direct extension of the state's psychological operation on the United States. And they've already surrendered their autonomy to that. So they're not thinking critically. So imagine the harm that they can do when they have somebody's mind in front of them who is struggling and who is vulnerable. And what if that's a young person, like an adolescent? And so that's why I think you have to be very careful of the mental health professional that you choose. They should be thoroughly vetted.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny. I so to give the last word on this, I have a psychologist friend who is in agreement with you, but she's retired. And I asked her the very same question, and she's like, "Oh my God, the whole profession," like. And we go to Psychology Today used to be a magazine. That's also kind of referral basis. And so I showed her a bunch that, some of whom she knew. It's like, no. Whom do you want to see? And it's kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of like, newspapers or, that I've ever seen that thing where they have all the newscasters and somebody did like Hollywood Squares of like 30 newscasters all saying the same line. It seems like everyone's just kind of have this little, player piano roll in their heads. And they're all saying the same thing now. And it's like, I don't see how that's helpful at all. It takes away the individual from individual psychotherapy. So I guess I did get the last word, and I'll owe you one for the next time. But people can find you at a variety of different places. Let's see. The last one I want to put up is your podcast. This is Radically Genuine, and it is. I think it is. It's reasonably apt. It's radically genuine. So, I very much in your debt, and I'm honored to have had you on the show. Thank you so much, Dr. McFillin.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate it.